I remember the day they told me the college fund was gone, as if the air had been pulled from the room. My parents sat across from me with polite faces, while they explained that the money would go to my brother because he was the golden child who needed a fresh start. They used words that sounded reasonable when aimed at someone else's problems, but the meaning landed like a weight on my chest and rearranged the map of my future. At 19, I felt small in my own house, watching their faces brighten at his news while I swallowed the sudden, sharp disappointment without protest. I left the conversation holding a paper cup of coffee and a pocket full of indignation, deciding then to cradle the indignation into something useful. I did not speak aloud about the plan they announced as if it belonged to someone else. Instead, I made a quiet calculation about what I could accomplish with time and cunning. I also recognized how families can tell stories that serve others with the labor of recovery and resilience. That was the day I started keeping receipts of quiet commitments to myself that looked like late-night tutorials and mornings spent piecing things together. I suspected then that my life would require improvisation rather than favors, and that suspicion hardened into a steady resolve over the following months. The first step was practical. Find steady income to pay the bills and keep learning at night. I took a job with long hours because it demanded little explanation and gave me space to cultivate the one thing they had not noticed: my curiosity. The plan I sketched privately involved no dramatic confrontations, only small disciplined acts that would compound into options I could actually choose. I found work to survive and to prove something to myself, taking shifts that stretched into dawn and learning technical skills in stolen hours between customers. While the steam rose from the espresso machine, I practiced code snippets on my phone, and after the last tip, I drilled video lectures on a battered laptop. The nights were long and the days were full, but I relished the small victories, a circuit that finally completed, a function that executed without error. I did not tell my parents about the things I studied. I learned quietly and stubbornly, like a craftsman who polished tools in secret to avoid being interrupted. There were moments I questioned whether the fatigue would swallow me, yet the momentum of learning felt like a private ladder I was building for a future I intended to climb. With sketches, logged online course completions, and began crawling through forums where people solved problems without needing prestige. When friends asked how I juggled it all, I gave practical answers, deflecting from the old wound of the lost fund and instead showing the ledger of hours and experiments. The busyness taught me discipline and a kind of humility that makes skill durable, because you are too busy solving problems to ask permission for recognition. Over time, my curiosity changed shapes into something more precise, an itch about inexpensive sensors and how common devices could be smarter without being pricey. The idea that became the core of everything started as a small, practical irritation with devices that felt expensive and fragile to ordinary users. I sketched alternatives on napkins and tested cheap sensors from surplus stores, assembling awkward prototypes in a shoebox that smelled faintly of solder and coffee. It was not a glamorous birth, but it had the kernel of something useful. Inexpensive sensors with smarter calibration that could automate mundane tasks people overlooked. I refined the concept in margins of time, balancing feasibility with imagination, and began to believe that engineering solutions could open doors everyone else had closed for me. I tested early concepts on friends and neighbors who tolerated my half-finished gadgets, and the feedback was pragmatic and brutally honest in a way I needed. They cost without creating value. What emerged was a pragmatic product strategy rather than a theoretical exercise. build small, reliable functionality at a price point that allowed ordinary users to adopt it without applying for a budget. That orientation to practical needs shaped the tone of everything I did afterward and kept my designs honest in the messy environment of real lives. My first prototype was clumsy but alive, a tangle of wires and hopeful code that blinked when it should have and sputtered when it shouldn't. I brought it to a local gardener who agreed to test it in a small greenhouse in exchange for free monitoring during the season. Watching the system adjust humidity and trigger fans at tiny thresholds felt like a revelation. The plants thrived, and the owner laughed at the simplicity of the result. That laugh was a reward I had not anticipated. It tasted like permission to keep going and proof that small inventions could yield meaningful impact. The prototype was proof of concept in the truest sense, and it strengthened my resolve to pursue a product that could serve. Triangulating customer value quickly taught me that the user's lived problem is a more reliable design brief than a prestige award or an academic endorsement. I continued to iterate, scraping together parts from different sources and learning to standardize some components to reduce failure rates. Each small iteration taught me more about manufacturability than any classroom could have, and I began to see a pathway from shoebox prototype to a product that could sit on a shelf and be trusted. I filed a provisional patent quietly, like tucking a secret into a safety deposit box, because I feared what visibility might invite from family or opportunists. Filling out the paperwork taught me an unfamiliar language of claims and embodiments that felt oddly like storytelling, clear, precise descriptions that framed utility and novelty. Each clause required care. I learned to describe the invention so others could understand it while protecting the core idea from being easily copied without crossing legal lines. When I mailed the documents, I felt both exposed and safeguarded, relieved that the concept had a formal voice that could defend the years of quiet toil behind it. That provisional filing bought me time to iterate, to test commercially viable paths, and to grow confidence that secrecy could be a strategic advantage during fragile early days. The legal step created partners with a seriousness that would have been missing otherwise. I used the provisional filing to anchor my future negotiations and to show that this project had moved from hobby to intellectual property that warranted risk. The microseed investment came from a small group who valued practicality over flash. Their belief was cautious but tangible, and it allowed us to recruit a few dedicated people. I hired a freelance firmware engineer and a logistics coordinator who understood how to scale manufacturing without breaking the bank, and we began to move from prototype to product. Our team was tiny and resourceful, driven more by purpose than salary, and we learned to celebrate small operational wins that kept production steady and customers satisfied. I learned to balance leadership with technical work, toggling between firmware bugs and supplier negotiations while keeping the product vision clear and customer-focused. This early team taught me the value of selective trust. Give responsibility to people who show care for the mission and protect the core intellectual property fiercely. As we refined the design and produced a small batch, early customers offered concrete suggestions that improved reliability. And word of mouth started to trickle in. The microseed allowed us to test the market without forfeiting control, giving me an environment where measured growth could replace frantic scaling and maintain the ethos of reliability that had defined the product from the start. Scaling introduced new headaches, supply chain complexity, customer support expectations, and competitors who tried to replicate our approach with cheaper components. We invested in quality control and robust onboarding materials because we knew that accessibility meant supporting non-technical users through the first setup hiccups. Revenue grew in a way that felt solid rather than spectacular, which suited me. The steady accumulation of users and subscriptions provided a rhythm we could depend on. I also prioritized legal preparedness, converting the provisional filing into a full patent application with careful claims designed to protect the core algorithmic advantage. Protecting the idea allowed us to negotiate from strength with distributors and prevented casual knockoffs from eroding our market position during the critical scaling phase. The team grew cautiously, with each hire evaluated for alignment with our values rather than just experience. We set aside a small defense fund for IP matters and focused on customer retention, because durable relationships were the surest path to a sustainable business. I planned a quiet reveal to my family that would show, without spectacle, the life I had built. With stability came a sense of responsibility. I used company resources to fund modest benefits for employees and created a foundation offering microgrants to aspiring technicians without formal schooling. I remembered the ways lack of support had shaped me and aimed to remove those obstacles for others, building internships that paid living wages and workshops that taught practical skills. This work felt like healing rather than revenge, channeling old hurts into structural opportunities that mattered more than any celebrity moment. Our priorities reinforced the company culture: humility, reliability, and an insistence that skill and work should open doors regardless of pedigree. Those values guided hiring and partnerships and made success meaningful because it created ripple effects beyond my own bank balance and reputation. The foundation remained intentionally modest and local at first, measured in meaningful outcomes rather than headlines, and it allowed me to direct resources in ways that honored the small, practical improvements I understood best. As press interest grew, I found myself speaking at panels and writing about non-traditional paths. And the narrative shifted from a single triumph to a responsibility toward the community that had supported me. I used the platform to highlight access issues and pragmatic solutions, advocating for programs that taught skills on the ground and invested in people rather than vanity metrics. The recognition came with scrutiny, but the evidence of installations and satisfied customers made critiques about pedigree seem less important. I also doubled down on governance to prevent mission drift, bringing in advisors who prioritized long-term impact and community accountability over short-term exits. It turned out that shaping the conversation mattered as much as shaping the product. Stewardship became another kind of engineering challenge to get right. I was careful to let the metrics of impact inform our choices and to stay accountable to the communities we served rather than to celebrity. There were moments of sharp emotion when old memories resurfaced, but I learned to address them with practical decisions rather than performative gestures. I declined financial requests that felt like old patterns, offered structured mentorship to those who asked genuinely, and redirected resources towards sustainable programs. My brother's growth was slow but real. He enrolled in classes and accepted small responsibilities within the company, learning that accountability yields different and steadier rewards. The family relationship reconfigured itself into something less entangled with expectation and more grounded in negotiated respect, which felt like the most adult resolution of all. The work of rebuilding trust, when it happened, was humble and incremental, and I found that the quiet progress was more satisfying than theatrical victory. Over time, the cycle between expectations and outcomes became less volatile and more oriented around competence and mutual responsibility. Looking back, the most important change was internal. I replaced a hunger for approval with a practice of building institutions that outlived any single triumphs. I invested in youth programs, mentorship, and a company culture that valued competence over charm. And in doing so, I changed not only my trajectory, but also the paths available to others. Some relatives expressed surprise that resilience could translate into formal success. Others simply celebrated and asked how they could support the foundation's work. I still felt the odd pang when remembering the years I had to work double shifts and teach myself in the dark. But those memories now carried gratitude for the lessons that shaped my leadership. The arc from being denied college funds to securing a patent and creating opportunities felt like a quiet recalibration of justice rather than a dramatic revenge plot. That inward recalibration allowed me to invest outwardly with both caution and generosity. I continued to build and to help others because that was the purpose that made sense to me after the years of scarcity and quiet work. The story did not end with vindication, but with continued responsibility, and I lived out the rest of the work with steady intention and a particular tenderness for those starting from scratch. I found peace in systems that rewarded skill and in the slow, satisfying accumulation of small changes that created durable outcomes. Success, in my view, was measured by whether more people could access a fair shot than before we started, and the metrics told a story of incremental but meaningful progress. If anything, I wanted the next generation to inherit fewer closed doors and more clear pathways to their own versions of independence. That became the metric of success that substituted for any earlier cravings for dramatic payback. Months into steady revenue and community traction, a mid-sized distributor approached with an offer to help scale nationally while allowing us to retain control of engineering and product direction. The proposal required careful negotiation because expansion could quickly dilute the values we'd built into the company culture. After long conversations and due diligence, we structured a partnership that injected capital while preserving control and our mission. The arrangement let us expand manufacturing, enter new geographic markets, and scale foundation grants, all while ensuring quality and accessibility remained central. The negotiation process tested my tolerance for complexity and taught me to balance short-term opportunity with long-term stewardship. It also validated the idea that growth need not erase ethics and that careful governance could preserve purpose during expansion. With the new partnership, we invested in supply chain improvements and dedicated a fraction of revenue to R&D for features that benefited the most vulnerable users. The team expanded cautiously, and we hired people who matched our mission and could solve practical engineering challenges at low cost. The product roadmap prioritized reliability, user support, and lowering barriers for non-technical adopters. That orientation attracted small and medium customers who valued dependability over glitzy marketing, and recurring revenue provided stability for ongoing social programs. The pragmatic path proved resilient during modest market shocks because our customer base appreciated problem-solving more than novelty. Over time, this conservative growth strategy built trust in our sector and allowed us to weather competitors who chased short-term wins with flashy but unreliable alternatives. As the company matured, I continued to steward the foundation and mentor young creators who lacked formal access to training. I built a program of paid internships tied directly to product assembly and device fieldwork so participants gained both technical skills and work experience. Watching interns who once lacked confidence become competent technicians offered a deeper satisfaction than any valuation headline. That hands-on approach reinforced the idea that skill building and paid opportunities create durable pathways out of precarity. The social impact dimension of the company made the financial success meaningful because it returned advantage to communities that typically lacked institutional support. The interplay of business and mission became the reason the company survived and the mechanism by which the past was finally reframed into future capability. Despite outward success, the private parts of my life required continuous boundary work. Family calls sometimes reopened old wounds and old expectations. I learned to answer family questions without overexposing myself and to set firm lines around what I would or would not subsidize. Those boundaries helped transform painful patterns into manageable interactions. For example, when my brother asked for investment in a risky venture, I offered mentorship instead and declined to bankroll it. That refusal was practical rather than punitive, an attempt to encourage accountability and personal growth rather than to punish. The relationship evolved into a mix of occasional support and expectation of effort, and that structure created a healthier dynamic than the earlier pattern of unconditional financial rescue. Months later, an invitation arrived for a family reunion, where relatives would gather and people would inevitably ask about the success story they had heard about in passing. I debated attending because family events can reopen old dynamics, but I decided to go with clear boundaries and a quiet purpose, to be present without being consumed. I prepared mentally, planned a calm way to answer questions, and brought along a small, refined device as a quiet demonstration of the work. At the reunion, my presence had a different quality than before. I was no longer a child waiting for permission, but an adult with a company to tend and clarity about what I would accept in interactions. That change in posture shifted the tone of conversations that might otherwise have returned to old grievances. People asked practical questions, and I answered plainly. The exchange felt like the most ordinary form of accountability. Show the work, describe the process, and let evidence do the speaking. At the reunion my parents attended and seemed tentatively pleased, their demeanor a mix of pride and awkwardness as they navigated the social circulation of news. A cousin asked about how we manufactured components affordably, and I explained supply chain choices and R&D trade-offs in simple terms. The conversation felt like a professional exchange rather than a private reckoning, which suited me because evidence is an easier teacher than recrimination. My father made an offhand reference to the past and the college fund. I acknowledged it plainly and then shifted the conversation to the work at hand, refusing to let old wounds dominate a public gathering. That refusal was itself a boundary that allowed for future private conversations rather than public drama. The reunion closed without fireworks and with the quiet satisfaction that my life had matured into something people could understand on pragmatic terms. My brother's path shifted slowly into something steadier. He enrolled in community coursework and began showing up consistently for small assignments within our operations on a provisional basis. We set clear expectations and evaluated his performance like any other contractor, and the structure allowed him to learn accountability through concrete tasks and measured feedback. Watching him accept small responsibilities and complete them changed the tenor of our relationship. I could offer coaching without enabling and maintain distance where necessary. That evolution was neither dramatic nor complete, but it represented a healthier configuration than the earlier cycles of crisis and rescue. I found that compassion and firmness could coexist, explain the standard, provide support to meet it, and do not supply what needs to be earned. As the company continued to grow regionally, we faced new competitors and a marketplace that demanded constant attention to reliability and support. We invested in a customer success team and improved documentation to reduce onboarding friction for non-technical users. Those practical investments kept churn low and allowed the business to scale more sustainably than chasing rapid expansion. I also prioritized product upgrades that served real needs rather than chasing features that only dazzled investors. That pragmatic approach deepened trust and sustained growth because customers stayed and referred others. Business health translated into more capacity for the foundation, and the whole ecosystem began to feel like a coherent expression of the values that had propelled the work. A year after the patent grant, our team landed a partnership that expanded distribution nationally. while keeping the company independent on operational matters. The deal included manufacturing scale-up, improved logistics, and an agreement to preserve our pricing tier for smaller customers who otherwise might be priced out after scaling. Structuring the agreement this way felt like a moral win. Success would not cannibalize the access we had fought to protect. The negotiation process was intricate and demanded clear priorities. In the end, we secured capital and distribution without surrendering control of the engineering roadmap. That victory allowed us to innovate further while staying responsible to the communities that made early adoption possible. As revenue stabilized and impact programs matured, I reflected often on the formative years when I juggled jobs and taught myself the technical fundamentals. Those memory arcs were painful but instructive. Rather than fueling revenge fantasies, they directed me towards system building and durable opportunity. I continued to invest in training programs and small grants, and I watched participants graduate into stable technical roles. That outcome felt like soft vindication. Not a spectacle that humiliated people who wronged me, but a practical reordering where talent could find footing irrespective of family expectations. The work of creating that ecosystem became the engine that replaced bitterness with purposeful attention to translating scarcity into capability. Throughout this period, my public profile grew gradually and with a focus on substance. Panels about non-traditional education, op-eds about access to tech training, and interviews that emphasized practical solutions. I used the platform to suggest policy changes and to encourage funders to back on-the-ground projects that worked with modest budgets. The attention broadened the foundation's support and attracted collaborators who wanted to scale skills-based initiatives. I remained wary of sensational narratives about overnight success because my story was the opposite: years of consistent, often monotonous work that accumulated into leverage. That insistence on a faithful narrative helped preserve credibility and directed attention to the long-term work we wanted to expand. Occasionally, old resentments would surface at night, triggered by a memory or a phrase, but I treated those stings the way I treated bugs in code: diagnose, patch, and move forward. I spoke with mentors when the emotions felt too intrusive, and used reflective practices to prevent resentment from shaping unhelpful decisions. Those habits allowed me to stay strategically focused rather than being hijacked by short-term impulses. Over time, the emotional temperature of the past cooled, weaving clarity about the kind of professional life I wanted to build and the ways to support others who started from similarly narrow beginnings. The narrative that remained was less about revenge and more about competence with compassion. People outside our direct circle began to notice the company's impact in measurable ways: increased yields for small urban farms using our sensors, reduced labor costs for small enterprises, and trainees who found paid technical roles. Those outcomes validated the product-market fit and reinforced the mission-driven approach. Local press covered case studies and highlighted the social programs we managed, and that attention helped attract partnerships that expanded distribution while preserving executive control. The satisfaction came from evidence of real benefits rather than public validation. The metrics were the true applause. With stable partners and a growing customer base, we continued investing in R&D to improve reliability and affordability, keeping the product aligned with the needs of small operators and individuals alike. My parents reached out more often with questions that suggested a new curiosity rather than the old reflex to celebrate my brother's missteps. Those conversations felt less performative and more curious, and I engaged with patience, explaining the architecture of the product and how patent protection had helped secure our progress. Their apologies arrived in fits, some tentative, and others more reflective. And I learned to accept them without making the past dominate present relationships. I let the work speak more than my words and kept boundaries where necessary to avoid being conscripted into old patterns that had eroded my own opportunities years earlier. Those newly tempered conversations were part reconciliation, part mutual learning. My brother's attempt to start independent ventures after seeing our progress led to predictable challenges, but he approached them differently this time, more slowly, with concrete learning tasks and professional mentoring. He showed up for scheduled responsibilities, accepted constructive criticism, and asked for help in ways that did not assume entitlement. I offered advice and set clear terms about compensation and accountability. And his gradual improvement reinforced the value of structured support over handouts. Watching him show up for the work without relying on charm alone gave me quiet satisfaction. It meant the family dynamics that once protected him were loosening and replaced by standards that applied to everyone equally. As stability grew, I started hosting workshops and technical clinics in partnering community centers, giving direct instruction on device assembly, firmware basics, and entrepreneurial fundamentals. Those sessions were deliberately hands-on and paid because unpaid learning disproportionately excludes those who cannot afford the time or resources. The clinics produced internships and jobs, and local employers began to hire people we trained. The ripple effects felt tangible. Small businesses stayed open longer, and early adopters reported better margins. The pairing of product and training made the impact durable because users could maintain systems themselves rather than depending on outside technicians at high cost. A year after scaling nationally, an acquisition offer arrived that was financially attractive but posed risks to our mission and independence. I evaluated the offer through the lens of impact and governance and determined that a partial partnership preserving operational control would better serve our long-term goals. We negotiated terms that allowed capital infusion while maintaining our product roadmap and pricing tiers for small users. The resulting partnership provided resources to expand manufacturing and the foundation, without compromising the mission at the company's core. Structuring the deal required trade-offs and discipline, and the result felt like a strategic success rather than a surrender. The company culture matured into something intentional, processes for accountability, a governance structure that included community input, and an emphasis on humility in leadership. I encouraged people to ask hard questions, to test assumptions, and to keep the user's lived experience central to product decisions. That culture attracted people who were motivated by the tangible problem-solving work we did rather than by prestige alone. The combination of good governance and clear values allowed us to scale without losing the qualities that made the product both reliable and accessible. The ongoing work became less about proving worth and more about building trustworthy systems that produced consistent benefits. In quiet moments of reflection, I sometimes imagine an alternate life where my parents had invested in my education as they had in my brother's. I considered how different mentors and opportunities might have shaped me, and those thoughts were bittersweet. Rather than using those imaginings as fuel for bitterness, I treated them as historical what-ifs, interesting but not actionable. My focus remained on the present possibilities and on creating structures that allowed other people to avoid the dead ends we'd experienced. That pragmatic posture kept me invested in the work rather than in old grievances, and it informed how I allocated time and capital across business and social programs. As years passed, the company's profile grew, but the work remained practical. We introduced enterprise features for large facilities while maintaining low-cost consumer options, striking a balance that preserved access without sacrificing growth. The absurdity of my childhood humiliation faded as the company's products proved useful in ordinary ways, and community feedback replaced the need for dramatic closure. I found satisfaction in the repeated, unglamorous tasks that make products dependable, and in mentoring others to find dignity in steady competence, rather than the quest for spectacular recognition. That consistency became the quiet form of justice that replaced the older hunger for revenge. The family relationship continued to evolve on a schedule set by boundaries and accountability. My parents and brother found ways to interact that respected my limits while allowing for curiosity and connection. Their apologies matured into questions about the product's social programs and how to support them, and my brother worked in a role where he could contribute concretely without expecting rescue. Those changes made our interactions less volatile and more productive. I accepted invitations cautiously and directed conversation toward shared interests like community impact, steering away from the old cycles that had once dictated our roles. Over time, those shifts produced a new normal. I used company resources to expand the foundation's reach into nearby towns, offering paid internships and microgrants that covered prototype costs for entrepreneurs with limited means. The programs emphasized practical metrics: jobs created, devices deployed, and incomes improved, rather than publicity alone. Tracking those metrics allowed us to iterate on training and funding and to scale what genuinely worked. Seeing alumni of the program move into technical careers was the concrete payoff. People who once lacked access were now technically competent and financially more secure. That diffusion of capability felt like the fullest form of reparation I could imagine. Structural changes in opportunity rather than symbolic gestures. Occasionally, comments from people who believed in pedigree over practice surfaced and tried to discount the route I had taken. But those critiques never landed with much force among the communities who directly benefited from our work. The evidence of installations and improved livelihoods outweighed rhetorical objections about degrees or pedigree. I stayed intentional about hiring for demonstrated skill and potential rather than just resumes, which diversified our talent and made operations more resilient. That practice aligned with the Foundation's mission and kept internal culture grounded in capability over status. The practical outcomes kept the narrative honest and prevented distraction from the mission. There were still moments when the old wound flared. A recollection of the family conversation where the money was reassigned would surface and momentarily sting. But those moments were bounded and brief. I learned techniques to manage the emotional spike, turn it into constructive planning, or let it pass without allowing it to reorder my decisions. That emotional literacy helped me be consistent in leadership and present in relationships. Because old hurts no longer hijacked my choices. Time and deliberate attention had converted reactive feelings into deliberate priorities, and the company into an engine for opportunity rather than an arena for personal spectacle. As the business continued to mature, I kept reinvesting in training and access, and I started a speaker series to help other founders who had unconventional education pathways. The series emphasized step-by-step practical guidance and brought in mentors who could translate academic concepts into implementable practices. The attendance was modest but impactful. Participants reported learning concrete skills they could apply to prototypes and early business operations. The return on that work was not immediate wealth, but an accumulation of networked capacity that strengthened local ecosystems. That network effect felt like the best outcome from the long years of hidden effort. When I looked back at the arc, from being told the college fund was redirected through late nights learning, prototyping in a shoebox, filing a patent, building a company, and investing in others, what stood out was the cumulative power of steady, unglamorous work. I had expected the satisfaction to be a single triumphant moment, but instead it was the daily proof that I could create systems that produced better outcomes than the ones I had been handed. The life I built required discipline, humility, and a willingness to redirect anger into architecture that expanded opportunity. That felt like justice to me, not the humiliation of others, but the construction of a future where fewer people would be denied access by family assumptions. In closing, I want to say that success isn't always swift vengeance. It's a slow construction of competence, boundaries, and generosity. I reclaimed what was taken through persistence, secrecy when necessary, and a refusal to accept narratives that dismissed my potential. I built a company, secured a patent, and created channels of opportunity for people like me. And in doing so, I redefined what it meant to win. My family and I are still learning new ways to relate, but the arc of our lives has shifted toward responsibility and mutual accountability. If there is an outro to this chapter, it is simple: build, guide others, and protect the structures that open doors, rather than spending energy on spectacle.